$250. That's what I paid for a dead man's bakery. Behind the brick oven in the back room, my hand found a seam that shouldn't have been there. Inside was a floor safe holding almost $12 million in cash, and taped beside it, a small handheld cassette recorder with a tape already loaded inside. I pressed play, and the first word out of that little speaker was, "Finally! Welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. 6 weeks before I found nearly $12 million behind a bread oven, my biggest problem was a broken kayak rack and a stack of ungraded lab reports. That's the honest scale of things. I was 39, divorced, and living alone in a rented duplex on the edge of Hartwell, Vermont, a town small enough that the hardware store still ordered your birthday cake from a bakery 3 towns over. I taught high school chemistry at Hartwell Regional, a room that smelled permanently of sulfur no matter how many windows I propped open. I drove a 2016 Subaru with a check engine light I'd learned to ignore, and I spent most weekends at my kitchen table with my cat, Biscuit, asleep in the fruit bowl he'd long ago decided was his. My name is Nora Bennett. I'd been Nora Callahan for 9 years of marriage, then Nora Bennett again after the divorce finalized 2 years before any of this started. It hadn't ended in dramatic collapse. My ex-husband, Mark, wanted a different life than the one we'd built, and I wanted the quiet, predictable one I already had. We split the house, split the furniture, and agreed to be polite at holidays. I kept the cat. He kept the good kayak. I told myself I got the better deal. My finances were fine, but narrow. I had a little over $20,000 saved, guarded the way you guard something you built slowly. I've always been careful with numbers, precise, patient, suspicious of anything that looks too easy. Which is exactly why I still can't fully explain what possessed me on a rainy Tuesday night in late September, scrolling county tax auction listings at 11 with cold peppermint tea beside my laptop, when I clicked a listing for a commercial property on Kettle Street, in the old mill district most people drove through without noticing. The listing described the building plainly. Brick storefront, roughly 1,100 square feet, formerly Voss's Bakery, vacant since the early 2000s, sold as is with no guarantee of utilities or interior condition. The attached photo was grainy, showing a faded painted sign that still read Voss Bakery, fresh daily in letters gone the color of wheat coffee. The starting bid was $250. I looked up the building's history before I did anything else. It had belonged to a man named Walter Voss, who, according to the obituary, I found had died that June at 84. The obituary was 3 sentences long, listing no surviving spouse or children, noting only that he'd operated Voss's Bakery on Kettle Street for over 40 years before its closure. The county had taken the property for unpaid taxes going back nearly 2 decades, which told me it had likely sat untouched since well before his death, a relic nobody had bothered to fight for. I told myself I'd use it for storage, maybe convert the front room into a tutoring space. $250 felt less like an investment and more like a rounding error, the kind of number that makes sense at 11 at night. I placed the bid. Nobody else did. 4 days later, the county deed transfer was final, and the building on Kettle Street belonged to me. I drove out the following Saturday to see what I'd bought. The bakery sat at the end of a short, emptied-out block, flanked by a shuttered hardware store and an overgrown lot. The brick facade was soot-stained near the roofline, and the front windows were papered over from inside with decades-old newspaper gone the color of tea. The door was locked with a rusted padlock that took 20 minutes and a can of oil to convince open. Inside, the air was thick and still, smelling of flour dust and cold ash and something faintly sweet underneath it all, like the walls remembered baking bread even after 20 years of silence. The front room held a small retail counter, a glass display case gone opaque with grime, a few collapsed wire shelving units. Weak gray light came through gaps in the newspapered windows. I stood there and told myself, the way you do, that it had potential. The back room held the real bones of the building. It was larger than I expected, maybe 600 square feet, dominated entirely by an enormous brick oven built into the rear wall, the kind of old wood and coal-fired hearth oven bakeries used generations ago. It was easily 8 feet wide, rising almost to the ceiling, a solid mass of brick with a heavy cast iron door blackened with age. It must have cost a small fortune. Nobody tears something like that out. They just close the door and walk away, which is apparently exactly what Walter Voss had done. I ran my hand along the brickwork, half admiring it, half wondering what it would cost to have hauled out if I ever wanted the space for anything else. That was when I noticed that a section of brick along the oven's left side, low near the floor, sat at a very slightly different angle than the rest, a hairline seam where the mortar looked newer, or at least less crumbled, than everything around it. I crouched down and pressed against it. It gave, just slightly, like something built to look permanent that wasn't. I don't know what made me keep pressing. Call it curiosity, or the same restlessness that got me bidding on abandoned buildings at 11 at night. I found the edge of what turned out to be a hinged iron panel, disguised with a thin veneer of brick facing, and worked my fingers into the gap until I could pull it open. It swung outward with a groan, revealing a cavity built into the oven's foundation, no larger than a closet, lined in the same dry, cold concrete you'd expect from a root cellar. And bolted to the floor at its center was a safe. It was a heavy floor safe, the old-fashioned kind, dark green enamel gone dull with age, with a combination dial and a small brass plate on the front that had once probably borne a manufacturer's name, long since worn illegible. My flashlight swept across the dial and caught a faint scratch mark below it, 4 numbers etched into the paint. I crouched there in that cramped little chamber for a long moment, listening to the wind rattle the loose flashing on the roof, before I reached for the dial with hands that were not entirely steady. The combination worked on the first try, which felt, at the time, like something closer to fate than luck. The heavy door swung open with a groan, and I don't have adequate words for what came next. The inside was packed floor to ceiling with bundled cash, $100 bills wrapped in paper bands, filling every inch of space. Wedged against the top bundle, in a freezer bag gone cloudy with age, sat a small handheld cassette recorder, a tape already loaded inside, and a word written across a strip of masking tape on the front. Play. My hands were unsteady as I worked the bag open and pressed the button. The little speaker crackled, hissed, and then a man's voice, dry and slow and clearly old, filled that cold room, and I heard the first word. Finally, it said. Finally, someone bothered to look past the front counter. If you're hearing this, you're the kind of person who checks behind things, and this whole safe is yours now, fair and square, county deed and all. I built this bakery with my own 2 hands starting in 1979, and I ran it over 40 years, and every dollar in here came from decades of careful saving, cash sales, tips, money I never once trusted to a bank because I watched one fail when I was young and never forgave the idea of them. I paid my taxes on what I earned while I was earning it. What I saved after is mine to give as I see fit. I've got a daughter. Her name's Renee. She talked me into remortgaging this building 22 years back to bankroll a business of her own that folded inside a year, and when the bakery couldn't recover, I closed the doors and never opened them again. She knows why she isn't on this tape. I'm leaving the building to the county, not to her, because I don't want her to have so much as the bricks. Whoever finds this earned it by being the kind of person who looks twice at what everyone else walks past. Do something worthwhile with it. Walter Voss. The tape hissed softly once more, then clicked off on its own, and the little room went quiet again. I stayed in that little concrete chamber for what felt like a very long time. Then I closed the safe, swung the iron panels shut, walked back through the front room, locked the broken padlock as best I could, got in my car, and drove home in a kind of controlled silence I don't fully remember. I didn't stop for groceries the way I'd planned. I fed Biscuit his dinner on autopilot, sat down at my kitchen table, and stared at the wall for close to an hour. The first thing I felt was fear, plain and total, the kind that has nothing to do with logic. What I had just found wasn't simply an unusual discovery. It was a situation with enormous, tangled, potentially life-altering consequences, and I was a chemistry teacher who structured her professional life around measurable, repeatable outcomes, who had never dealt with anything that couldn't be resolved with a lesson plan and a phone call home. The second thing I felt, right behind the fear, was the need to know exactly how much money I was looking at. I went back the next morning with a duffel bag, a legal pad, and a calculator, and spent nearly 4 hours in that little chamber counting, rest-hacking every bundle, logging the denominations, checking the paper bands for consistency. When I finished, I sat on the cold concrete floor and stared at the number I'd written at the bottom of the page. $11,850,000 in cash. I drove home, made coffee I didn't drink, and forced myself to think methodically, one variable at a time. The money was real. The deed was legally mine. Walter's tape suggested the funds were decades of legitimate, if undeclared, personal savings, not proceeds of anything criminal. But nearly $12 million in undeclared cash raised questions I had no training to answer. How had it accumulated without ever touching a bank? Was there a paper trail connecting it to the bakery's finances? Did the estate have any lingering claims on it? Was I legally obligated to report what I'd found, and to whom? I spent the better part of 3 days researching, and I didn't touch the money again, and I didn't tell a single soul, not my sister, not my closest friend Priya, not a single colleague at school. I went to work Monday and taught 2 sections of general chemistry and one of AP, graded a stack of lab safety quizzes, and ate a sandwich at my desk while my mind ran the same loop over and over. What is the right thing to do here? What is the smart thing to do here? And are those actually the same thing? By Thursday I had an answer, or at least the beginning of one. I needed a lawyer, and not just any lawyer. Someone who specialized in property law, ideally with direct experience in found property and abandoned asset cases. I wasn't going to walk into a police station with a duffel bag full of cash until I understood precisely what I was walking into and precisely what I stood to lose by walking in unprepared. That decision, slow and deliberate, and entirely unlike the impulse that got me into the auction in the first place, became the first solid plank in everything that followed. I spent that evening researching attorneys across the greater Burlington area, deliberately avoiding anyone local to Hartwell, where gossip moved faster than paperwork. I found a firm called Marsh and Whitfield that listed property and estate disputes among its specialties, and its lead partner, Elena Marsh, had a professional photograph showing someone with sharp, unhurried eyes and the look of a person who'd heard every version of every story you could bring her. I called the next morning and got an appointment for Tuesday. The weekend in between was harder than I expected. I drove out to the bakery Saturday just to check on it, sat in my car across the street, watching the building the way you watch something that has quietly become the center of your life without asking permission. I thought about Walter Voss, 84 years old, alone above a bakery he'd built with his own hands, spending decades tucking cash into a hidden floor safe rather than risk it reaching a daughter he no longer trusted. I thought about the single word he'd chosen to open that tape with. Finally. Not sorry, not forgive me. Finally. As though the discovery itself was something he'd been quietly waiting on for years. I drove home, fed Biscuit, sat on my back step for a while with him curled against my leg, and let myself feel, for exactly 1 hour, the full weight of what had shifted underneath my life. Then I put it away, the way you put away a test you can't grade until you have all the data. I needed Elena Marsh. I needed a plan. And for the first time since Tuesday night, I felt like I had the beginning of one. Elena Marsh's office occupied the 4th floor of a converted textile building overlooking Lake Champlain, and she listened to my entire story without interrupting once. The auction, the oven, the hidden panel, the safe, the tape, the money. I laid it out the way I'd laid out lab procedures for 20 years, chronologically, without embellishment. When I finished, she set down her pen and studied me for a moment. "How many people know about this?" she asked. "Just you," I said. She nodded slowly. "Let's keep it that way for now." Elena's first task was establishing exactly what I owned. The deed to the Kettle Street property was unambiguous. It was mine, purchased legally through a public auction. But the law surrounding large sums of undeclared cash discovered on that property was considerably murkier. Under Vermont law, when someone discovers abandoned personal property on land they legally own, the outcome hinges on whether the original owner intentionally abandoned it, whether any third party held a valid competing claim, and whether the funds connected to criminal activity. Walter's recording was significant evidence, a recorded statement from the deceased indicating deliberate concealment and exclusion of his daughter, but it wasn't a binding legal instrument. It was a tape, nothing more. Its contents could be challenged. "Who handled Walter Voss's estate?" she asked. I told her I assumed the estate had been settled, since the county had already liquidated the building through auction. "Let me pull the probate file," she said, making a note. "That's the first thing we need to understand." I left her office 2 hours later, having signed a retainer agreement, and handed over a short list of materials she needed: a copy of my deed, photographs of the hidden chamber and the safe, and the original cassette tape, which I'd had the foresight to record a clean digital copy of on my phone before I'd even climbed out of that little concrete cavity the first time. "You're organized," she said, with something close to surprise. "I teach chemistry," I told her. "Documentation is most of the job." The probate research took Elena 5 days, and what she found reshaped everything. Walter Voss did have a daughter, Renee Voss, now Renee Doyle after her marriage, 49, living about 40 minutes away in South Burlington. The probate filing showed Walter had left a formal will, executed a decade earlier, leaving his modest remaining personal property, a small checking account, some furniture, a handful of kitchen equipment, to a local culinary trade school scholarship fund. Renee was mentioned exactly once. "I leave nothing to my daughter, Renee Voss Doyle, for reasons she is well aware of." That language, Elena explained, deliberately foreclosed any argument that Walter had simply forgotten his daughter. But there was another detail that concerned her more. The attorney who'd handled Walter's probate, Douglas Kern, had been contacted that August by Renee Doyle, who'd asked a strange, specific question. Not about the will, which she already knew about. Whether there had been anything unusual found inside the bakery before it sold. "That's an odd thing to ask," I said when Elena told me. "It is," she agreed. "I think it's possible she knew her father kept money hidden somewhere on that property. Whether she knew about that specific chamber is a different question. But the fact that she asked about the building's contents immediately after it changed hands tells me she was looking for something." I sat with that for a moment, watching the gray afternoon light move across her office window. "What do we do?" I finally asked. "We file," she said. "We establish her claim formally through the probate court before Renee Doyle figures out exactly what she's looking for. We document everything, the deed, the discovery, the tape, the safe. We go on record first. In this kind of dispute, timing is nearly everything." We filed that Friday. Elena submitted a formal petition asserting my claim to the safe's contents as abandoned personal property discovered on real estate I had legally purchased. The filing was, unavoidably, a matter of public record, though we kept it as dry and procedural as language allows. But a filing is a filing, and 3 days later my phone rang at 7 in the morning from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The message was brief, the voice female, carefully even in the way of someone working hard to sound composed. "Miss Bennett," it said, "my name is Renee Doyle. I think we should talk." I played it twice, then called Elena. "Don't return it," she said immediately. "Not without me on the line." I hadn't planned to, but sitting at my kitchen table that morning with biscuit-weaving figure eights around my ankles, I felt the first real tremor of something I'd been managing to keep at a distance. This was no longer only my secret. Whatever was coming had already started. Elena arranged a conference call with Renee 3 days later, but Renee didn't wait. She called me directly twice more, and once sat parked in a silver sedan outside the school lot for nearly half an hour until I noticed, texted Elena in a rising panic, and was told to go back inside and photograph the car, which I did with hands shaking badly enough that the first 4 pictures came out blurred. The conference call, when it finally happened, ran 11 minutes. Renee was cordial in the specific way of someone working very hard at cordiality. She said she understood I had found something in the bakery, and that she simply wanted to discuss the situation, woman to woman, as her father's only living child. Elena informed her evenly that the probate court had already documented the estate's distribution and that Walter's will was explicit and had gone unchallenged. Renee said the will hadn't accounted for private family funds that had never been formally declared as part of the estate. Elena asked her to clarify what she meant by private family funds. A pause. "My father told me years ago there was money on that property," Renee said. "Family money. That's ours." "Did your father put that in writing anywhere, at any point?" Elena asked. Another pause. "It was a private conversation," Renee said. "I see," Elena said, in a tone I was already learning meant she'd heard this exact answer 100 times before. "We'll look forward to any documentation you're able to provide." The call ended shortly after. Elena warned me Renee would likely retain counsel of her own quickly, and she was right. A letter arrived at Elena's office 8 days later from a firm in Burlington, formally asserting that Renee Doyle intended to contest my petition on the grounds that the funds constituted undisclosed estate assets belonging rightfully to the deceased sole heir. What happened after that I hadn't fully braced for. It was a cold evening in early November, dark by 5, and I was in my kitchen grading essays with the radio on low when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Renee Doyle standing on my porch, a narrow woman with her father's sharp jaw and eyes that stayed just slightly too still. Beside her was a man I didn't recognize, broad-shouldered, in a barn jacket, hands jammed in his pockets. Her husband, Tom, as it turned out. "Miss Bennett," Renee said, "I think it's time we talked face to face." I should have closed the door immediately. Instead I said, as evenly as I could manage, "I'm sorry I can't speak with you directly while there's an active petition. You'll need to go through my attorney." I started to close it. Tom put a hand flat against the door frame, not shoving, just resting it there. "We're not here to fight," he said. "We're trying to save everyone a headache, including you, because there's things about that money you don't know. Things that could get uncomfortable for you fast if this goes to a hearing." "What things?" I asked. Renee's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "My father wasn't always a simple man," she said. "Some of the people he did business with over the years are still around. People who might be very interested to hear a stranger sitting on their money." I looked between them for a moment, trying to determine whether this was a real threat or theater, and deciding it genuinely didn't matter which. "Are you threatening me?" I asked. Tom took his hand off the door frame. "We're informing you," he said. "There's a difference." "Good night," I said quietly and shut the door. What they didn't know was that I'd started recording on my phone the second I saw Renee's silhouette through the peephole, a habit Elena had drilled into me from the very first week. I had every word. I called her from my bedroom because my legs had started shaking too badly to stand in the kitchen. She listened to the whole recording without interrupting. "Email that to me right now," she said when it ended. "Tomorrow morning we're filing an intimidation complaint with the Hartwell police." The police response was measured, not dramatic. An officer came, took my statement, listened to the recording, and issued Tom Doyle a formal warning. No arrest, not yet, but there was now a documented incident, and Renee's attorney had been formally notified. The week after that went quiet, the specific kind of quiet that happens when people regroup rather than retreat. I hadn't slept properly in almost 6 weeks by that point. I'd been carrying this entirely alone, and the strain of it was starting to show in small ways I recognized as unhealthy, short with students who didn't deserve it, forgetting a lab safety step I'd taught for 15 years, lying awake doing math that didn't need doing. I called Elena on a Friday afternoon. "I need a few days," I told her. "You've earned it," she said. "Nothing's moving on their end before the new year. Go somewhere. Don't tell anyone where." I drove up to a small inn near Stowe that weekend, alone except for Biscuit, and 2 novels I'd been meaning to read for over a year. I hiked short trails in the cold, ate hot food I didn't cook myself, slept 9 hours a night for 3 nights straight, and for the first time since September, let myself simply breathe without a countdown running underneath it. The first week of December brought snow to Hartwell and a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. The caller identified himself as Grant Ellison, a conflict resolution consultant retained, he said, by parties with an interest in the Voss property matter, and he'd love to grab coffee to discuss a resolution that would benefit everyone involved. He left a callback number. I forwarded the voicemail to Elena before I'd even finished listening to it. Her response came within the hour. "Do not call him back. Do not meet with him. Forward anything further directly to me." Grant Ellison was persistent. He called 3 more times, sent a polite, oddly formal email to an address he'd sourced somewhere on his own. Never rude, never overly threatening, just relentlessly, pleasantly present in the way of someone who understood how ordinary people were down under sustained, low-grade pressure. I was not, as it turned out, quite that ordinary. 20 years of teaching had taught me plenty about patient, repeated persuasion tactics, mostly from watching teenagers try them on me. On his 4th call, he offered me $150,000 and a signed release from any further claim by the Doyles. I let him finish. Then I said, "My attorney will remain my point of contact going forward," and hung up. I told Elena that afternoon. She was pleased, though she reminded me to log every contact in writing, date and summary. 150,000 against nearly 12 million. Did they genuinely believe I couldn't do that math? What I hadn't told Elena, what I hadn't told anyone, was that the accumulated isolation of the whole situation was costing me something real. Outwardly, I was managing, holding the line, making sound decisions, keeping my composure in front of students and colleagues who had no idea anything had changed. But there's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying something this large entirely by yourself, and it had been sitting on my chest since September. I wasn't sleeping through the night. I'd lost weight without meaning to. I would be fine for days at a stretch, and then sit down to dinner and suddenly not remember what ordinary felt like. I thought about it for 3 days. Then I called Priya. Priya Anand had been my closest friend since our first year of college, when we'd been randomly assigned as lab partners in an organic chemistry class neither of us liked. She'd flown in for my wedding and, quietly, driven up the day my divorce was finalized to sit with me and make sure I ate something. She was the kind of person who absorbed other people's weight without ever making you feel small for needing to hand some of it over. We met at her kitchen table on a Wednesday night after her kids were asleep. I told her everything. She listened the way Priya always listened, without filling the silences with noise of her own. When I finished, she wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at me for a long moment. "Are you scared?" she asked. "Some days," I admitted. "Are you going to win?" "Elena thinks so." "I think so." She nodded once. "Then stop acting like you have to carry this by yourself." It was exactly what I needed to hear. Not advice, not a plan, just permission to stop performing composure and let someone else sit with me in the middle of it. Priya became my anchor through the weeks that followed. She didn't tell a soul. I asked her not to, and she never once questioned that. But twice a week, Tuesday evenings and Sunday afternoons, she came over or I went to her, and we talked about the case, about how I was actually doing, about entirely unrelated things that had nothing to do with money or lawyers or Renee Doyle. She reminded me, repeatedly, that I was a person and not only a claimant in a legal file. Meanwhile, Elena's preparation moved forward with the same methodical steadiness I was starting to understand was simply how she worked. She deposed Douglas Kern, who confirmed under oath that Walter's will had been properly executed and that he'd had no prior knowledge of any hidden chamber or safe. She assembled the complete chain of title on the property and retained an expert in Vermont abandoned property law, a retired professor named Dr. Miriam Osei, who submitted a written opinion supporting my claim as legally sound. Renee's attorneys, in turn, filed a competing petition of their own, arguing that the funds constituted undisclosed estate assets that rightfully belonged to Walter's sole surviving heir. The trouble with that theory, Elena explained, was that Renee wasn't the estate's heir at all. Walter's will had left everything to the scholarship fund. Renee had no testamentary standing whatsoever. They know their case is weak, Elena told me. They're betting on delay and pressure wearing you down before it ever reaches a judge. Then let's not give them time, I said. Elena had already requested an expedited hearing. It was granted for mid-February. We had a little under 7 weeks. They came again 16 days before the hearing on a Saturday afternoon, and something about the visit was different from the start. I opened the door to find Renee and Tom standing together on my porch, Tom in a collared shirt instead of the barn jacket, Renee holding a small foil-covered dish that smelled unmistakably like banana bread. They looked, deliberately and almost absurdly, like neighbors dropping by to introduce themselves. "We're not here to fight," Renee said, holding up one hand in a gesture meant to signal peace. "We just want to talk like people." I should have said no. I almost said no. But something in me, the same instinct that makes a scientist want to see the full data set before drawing a conclusion, wanted to hear exactly what they thought they still had to offer this close to a hearing. "You have 10 minutes," I said, "and the door stays open." I didn't invite them in. We stood in the doorway, me on the inside, them on the porch. Renee holding the banana bred the entire conversation like a prop she'd forgotten to set down. She started with history. Her father had been a hard man, she said, closed off, punishing, and he'd cut her out of his life over what she described only as a misunderstanding about the business, offering no further detail, the practiced vagueness of someone who has rehearsed carefully not saying the actual thing. "All we're asking," Renee said, "is to be made whole. That money should never legally, I understand that, but morally it should stay in the family." "Your father didn't leave it to the family," I said. "He left the entire estate to a scholarship fund. He was sick toward the end," she said. "He wasn't himself." "The probate court reviewed that already," I said. "The will was upheld." Tom stepped in closer, his voice dropping to something almost gentle. "You have to understand, we've been struggling," he said. "The legal fees alone have put us in a real hole." He let the sentence trail off, letting the implications sit there. It was a well-rehearsed beat, and I'd spent 20 years watching teenagers try to make me feel responsible for consequences that weren't mine to own. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it to land as flatly neutral as it sounded. Renee's tone shifted then, still even, but with something harder running underneath it. "I know about the audit your school district ran on the chemistry department budget 2 years ago," she said. "The one with the missing supply reimbursements. It hadn't been about me at all. A clerical mix-up involving a colleague who'd since retired. But she said it like she'd rehearsed it for exactly this doorway. I know how that looks, though. Teacher with a district financial flag, suddenly sitting on $12 million in undeclared cash. That's a story that writes itself. To the IRS, to a reporter, to anyone who wants to connect dots that may or may not actually connect." There it was. I looked at her, then at Tom, who was studying a point somewhere just past my shoulder, which I'd already noticed was something he did whenever the conversation crossed a line he half recognized. You're suggesting, I said slowly, that if I don't settle, you'll imply to the authorities and the press that I'm hiding something. I'm suggesting your situation is more complicated than you think, Renee said. Thank you for coming by, I said and closed the door. I stood in my hallway for a long moment, heart going faster than I wanted it to. Then I walked to the kitchen counter, picked up my phone, and stopped the recording I'd started the instant the doorbell rang. What they didn't know, what I hadn't mentioned to anyone but Elena, was the exterior security camera installed on my porch back in November, the one that covered both the doorway and the front walk with clean audio. It had captured all of it. I texted Elena. They came again. Full audio and video. She referenced an old district budget flag that had nothing to do with me and implied she'd go to the IRS and the press if I didn't settle. She called within 20 minutes. They just built our case for us, she said, her voice quieter than usual, which with Elena meant she was completely focused. That's witness intimidation, and depending on how a prosecutor reads it, potentially extortion. Combined with the November incident, that's a documented pattern. I know, I said. Are you all right? I thought about it honestly before answering. What I actually felt, underneath the adrenaline, was something closer to relief. They'd shown me everything they had left. All the vague, shapeless threat that had been hovering over the past 4 months had finally crystallized into something concrete, something I could name and hand to a court. Fear is loudest in the dark. Bring it into the light, and it becomes evidence. I'm okay, I said. What do we do? We file a supplemental motion presenting the new recordings as evidence of bad faith intimidation, Elena said. And in 16 days, we walk into that hearing ready to close this out. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning at 9 in the Ashcombe County Probate Court, and I arrived at 8:15 wearing a dark charcoal blazer and almost no jewelry, on Elena's advice. You want to look like exactly what you are, she told me. A careful person a judge would trust with $12 million. I wore flat shoes and carried a leather folder I bought specifically for that morning, and I looked, I hoped, precisely like the version of myself I'd been building all along, someone who had done everything right and had the paperwork to prove it. Elena was already in the hallway outside the courtroom when I arrived, reviewing her notes with the calm of someone who had done this 100 times before. Beside her stood Dr. Osei, silver-haired and unhurried, the manner of a woman who had testified in more courtrooms than she could count and found the whole exercise mildly interesting rather than stressful. Renee and Tom arrived at 8:40. Renee's attorney, a man named Bradley Corse, moved with the practiced confidence of someone who billed by the hour and intended to be worth every one of them. Tom sat in the gallery and didn't look at me once. The judge was the Honorable Susan Whitcomb, early 60s, reading glasses on a beaded chain, an expression suggesting she had heard nearly every argument this room was capable of producing and had long since formed her own opinions about most of them. The hearing itself wasn't a trial, just a petition hearing, but in a contest between a meticulously prepared case and a poorly prepared one, the outcome is rarely suspenseful. Elena opened by laying out the legal foundation. I had purchased the Kettle Street property through a valid public tax auction. The deed was clean. The safe had been discovered within the physical bounds of that property, hidden in a chamber built decades before I ever set foot inside. She presented Vermont case law on abandoned personal property, specifically that when property is deliberately concealed on privately owned land and the original owner's intent to relinquish it can be reasonably documented, the landowner's claim is strong. She played Walter's cassette tape for the court in full. She presented Dr. Osei's written opinion, which characterized the tape as clear evidence of intentional abandonment and concluded the petitioner's claim was well grounded under Vermont law. She presented the probate filing, the will, and the explicit disinheritance clause naming Renee directly. Then she played the porch recordings. Bradley Corse objected on the grounds the porch recordings had been made without Renee's consent. Elena had anticipated exactly this. Vermont is a one-party consent state. I had been party to both conversations myself. The recordings were admissible without dispute. Judge Whitcomb listened to a significant portion of each one in full, and the courtroom went very quiet while she did. When she finally removed her reading glasses to look directly at Renee, I felt the entire room shift. "Counsel," she said to Corse, "your client is heard on this recording implying she would report the petitioner to federal tax authorities and to the media unless the petitioner agreed to abandon her legal claim. Is that your understanding of what occurred?" Corse cleared his throat. "Your Honor, that characterization. I'm asking if you dispute the recording," Judge Whitcomb said. A pause. "We dispute the characterization," Corse said carefully. "The recording speaks for itself," the judge replied, and put her glasses back on. Corse's remaining arguments landed without much force. He argued the undeclared cash effectively constituted an estate asset that had simply never been formally distributed. He argued Renee, as Walter's closest living relative, had standing to claim it regardless of the will's language. He argued the cassette tape itself carried no binding legal weight. Elena addressed each point in turn, precisely and without hurry. Walter's will had been properly executed and probated years earlier. The court had never been notified of any hidden cash because Walter had deliberately excluded it from the estate, a choice entirely consistent with what he'd said on the tape. Renee's status as closest living relative was irrelevant given the will's explicit, unambiguous exclusion clause. And while Walter's recording wasn't a formal testamentary document, Vermont courts had repeatedly recognized this kind of recorded statement as legitimate evidence of a deceased owner's intent in exactly this type of abandoned property dispute. Judge Whitcomb asked me 2 questions directly. First, whether I had known about the hidden chamber before purchasing the property. No, I told her I hadn't. Second, what I intended to do with the funds if my claim was upheld. I prepared for this one carefully. I intend to work with a tax attorney to fully satisfy any obligations owed to the IRS, I said, and I plan to direct a significant portion of what remains toward a scholarship and small business fund in Walter Voss's name, supporting culinary students and independent bakeries in this county. Judge Whitcomb wrote something down without comment. Then she looked at Renee one final time. "Mrs. Doyle," she said, "do you have any documentation whatsoever, correspondence, a recorded statement, any third-party verification, that your father ever communicated to you the existence of money stored on this property?" Renee shifted in her seat. "It was a private conversation," she said. "There was no—" "Thank you," Judge Whitcomb said. She announced she would issue a written ruling within 10 business days. The hearing ran 2 hours and 20 minutes. In the hallway afterward, Elena touched my arm once and said quietly, "Well done." Renee and Corse were speaking in low voices at the far end of the corridor. Tom stood near the elevator, arms crossed, staring at nothing in particular. I pressed the call button, stepped into the car when it arrived, and watched the lobby rise as the doors closed. I didn't know for certain yet, but I felt something like the end of a long storm settling over me, not the sun exactly, but the first real stillness after a lot of noise. Judge Whitcomb's written ruling arrived 8 days later. Elena called me at 10 in the morning on a Thursday, and I knew from the sound of my own name, before she'd said another word, exactly which direction it had gone. The ruling ran 38 pages. Elena had already read it twice, and gave me the summary before reading me the operative paragraph directly, the one that would appear in the final court order. The court ruled in my favor on every point. Judge Whitcomb's reasoning, Elena said, was thorough and unusually well argued, the kind of ruling that would hold up cleanly under any appellate review. She found the property had been legally purchased through a valid tax auction. She found the money, concealed inside a sealed chamber undisclosed to any party at the time of sale, constituted personal property deliberately separated from Walter Voss's estate by Walter himself, and abandoned within the bounds of real property that was now legally mine. Walter's tape, while not a formal testamentary instrument, was treated as strong corroborating evidence of deliberate, intentional abandonment. On Renee's competing claim, the judge found no legal basis whatsoever. Walters had explicitly disinherited her, and she had produced no documentation of any kind supporting a claim to the funds. Her theory of recovery failed at the most basic threshold question of whether she was an heir to the estate at all. She was not. On the recordings, the judge noted, in language I read 3 separate times that afternoon, that the conduct captured on audio and video, specifically the implied threat to contact federal authorities and the media, constituted bad faith intimidation of a party to active litigation, and she referred the matter to the Ashcombe County District Attorney's Office for review. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after Elena and I hung up. The money was mine, legally mine, subject to whatever I owed the IRS, which Elena had already arranged for a tax attorney named Priscilla Okafor to handle. Priscilla was precise and methodical in the way of someone who genuinely enjoyed the puzzle of a complicated return. She spent close to a month reviewing everything in full. The funds were treated as found income, taxable at ordinary rates in the year of discovery, with additional penalties applied for decades of undeclared cash. The total tax liability, including penalties, came to just over $4,460,000. I paid it without hesitation and without resentment. I'd spent 20 years teaching students that the work only counts if you show it honestly. I wasn't about to start cutting corners on my own account now. Combined legal fees, Elena's firm, Priscilla's work, Dr. Osei's testimony came to roughly $340,000. The net amount landed at just over $7 million. I sat with that figure for the better part of a week before it felt real. In the weeks that followed the ruling, several things happened in fairly quick succession. Renee, through Bradley Course, filed a notice of intent to appeal, which the Vermont Court of Appeals dismissed 4 months later for lack of any viable grounds. The Ashcombe County DA's office reviewed the recordings and ultimately filed charges, not extortion, which requires a completed demand paired with actual compliance, but a lesser charge of criminal harassment based on the documented pattern of unwanted contact and implied threats. Both Renee and Tom faced misdemeanor counts. Their combined legal costs across the original litigation, the failed appeal, and the criminal matter reached, by Elena's estimate, somewhere north of $200,000, money they did not, as it turned out, have. I knew this not because I tracked them obsessively, but because certain facts simply find their way to you without effort. Tom's small landscaping business had already been struggling before any of us started, and the litigation had pushed them close to the edge of insolvency. I thought about that sometimes, not with pure satisfaction, or not only with satisfaction. I thought mostly about Walter, who had lived out his final years alone above a bakery he'd built with his own hands, quietly saving for decades rather than trust a single dollar to a daughter he no longer believed in. What exactly Renee had done to earn that distrust, I would probably never fully know, and it wasn't my job to know. What I did know was this: I had found something a stranger had deliberately left behind for whoever cared enough and was careful enough and honest enough to do right by it. I had done what I could. The law had moved slowly and expensively and imperfectly, the way it usually does, and in the end it had landed on the right side of the line. I went to the bank the following Monday and opened a new account. The wire from escrow cleared 3 business days later. On the afternoon it cleared, I drove out to Kettle Street after school. I parked across the street and sat there a moment, looking at the building, gray brick, a faded painted sign, nothing to distinguish it from any other forgotten storefront on any other quiet block. Then I went inside, worked the hinge panel open one last time, and stood in the little concrete chamber in the beam of my phone's flashlight. The safe sat empty now, its door hanging open, the cold, dry air exactly the same as the first time. I thought about Walter's tape, about the single word he'd chosen to open it with. "Thank you, Walter," I said to the empty room. Then I swung the panel shut, locked the front door behind me, and walked out into the cold. I didn't quit my job right away. People assume that's the first thing you do when your life changes this dramatically, but I'd spent my whole life being careful, and $7 million didn't undo that instinct. I gave 4 weeks' notice in April, after the appeal was dismissed and the funds had cleared. My department chair, a kind, tired man named Gary, said he was sorry to lose me. I thanked him for 15 good years. What I did first, honestly, was rest. Real rest, the kind that returns gradually, the way color comes back into something gone gray. I slept without my phone on the nightstand. I took Biscuit to a groomer for the first time in his entire indignant life. I went for long, aimless drives, and discovered slowly that the world had small pleasures in it I'd stopped noticing while carrying something enormous through every ordinary day. In June, I bought a farmhouse with a wide-covered porch outside a small town called Ashford, 2 acres of woodland behind it, a general store where the woman behind the counter learned my coffee order by the 3rd visit, and a creek that flooded a little every spring in a way the whole town treated with a kind of fond, resigned affection. It was exactly the right size for a life. Biscuit discovered the porch railing and claimed it as decisively as he'd once claimed my fruit bowl, and Priya started calling it her porch too, which felt right, because by then it basically was. In the fall, I established the Voss Fund, using Walter's name because it felt like the only honest choice available to me. He'd spent 40 years building something alone, and at the very end, chosen to trust it to a stranger he hoped would turn out to be decent. The fund provides small business grants to independent bakeries and food shops across Vermont trying to survive their first hard years, along with a handful of full scholarships each year for culinary students who can't otherwise afford the training, a gap I understood a little too well from watching how many of my own students quietly gave up on trades they loved simply because nobody could front the cost of trying. I work with the fund part-time now, still tutor a handful of former students in chemistry because I genuinely miss it, and I am neither bored nor lonely, which surprised me more than the money ever did. As for Renee and Tom, plea deals, fines, a period of probation, no jail time. Tom's landscaping business folded that winter. They sold their house in South Burlington and moved somewhere I neither know nor feel any particular need to find out. I wish them, honestly, a quiet remainder. Walter had understood his daughter's character more clearly, in the end, than she ever gave him credit for, and he protected what he'd built accordingly. There's a photograph on my desk now, the bakery on Kettle Street, gray brick, a faded sign, an unremarkable building on an unremarkable street. It doesn't look like anything, and that's exactly the point. I bought it for $250 on a rainy Tuesday because a number made a strange kind of sense at 11 at night. Then I found a seam in a wall that wasn't quite like the rest of the wall, and I did the slow, careful work of making it mean something. Integrity isn't a strategy. It isn't something you deploy when it's convenient or perform when someone happens to be watching. It's what you are when you're standing alone in a hidden concrete chamber with almost $12 million and absolutely no one to tell you what to do next. I learned that at the foot of a hinged iron panel behind an old brick oven. Do the right thing when it's hard, not only when it's easy. Document everything as if someone will need to check your work later, because eventually someone will. Trust the slow, unglamorous machinery of the law even when it feels too slow to trust. Find at least one person willing to sit with you in the dark part of it. And never, not once, let fear make a decision that belongs to your integrity instead. If you found $12 million today, hidden behind an oven, in a building you legally owned, what would you actually do? Think about it honestly. Your answer will tell you more about yourself than you might expect. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for listening and for staying with me until the very end.